Anybody ever heard the documentary hypothesis? Raise your hand. I've heard of it.
Yes,
Yep.
sir.
Okay, 1878, a German philosopher scholar named Julius Wellhausen did a theory, and his theory is that the Torah, the Pentateuch, the five books were not written by Moses. And I'll tell you why that in a minute. But ultimately, what he was saying is that it was written by different groups of people in different time frames. So Moses wrote part of it, but other groups of people, priests or other groups, wrote other parts of it during different time frames, and they sort of redacted, they edited what Moses wrote and added to it, or maybe even delete it. And that was his theory, okay? Became very popular. And still a lot of people see this, and a lot of scholars see this. And I'll tell you, they see this because they don't really accept the miraculous ability of God, miracles. They don't really accept inspiration of God. But let me give you an overview of this theory and then refute it, okay? Because I want you to be aware of it. I don't want you to be an expert. I wouldn't waste my time being an expert. I'm not. But you should be aware of it because there's a good chance someone in your congregation has heard this and is asking the same kind of question. You need to be aware of it, okay? The thought is there are four different sources, four primary sources for the first five books of the Old Testament: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. One is what's called the Jehovah. Now, who really the source is, but they label it as Jehovah. They're not saying God wrote it, okay? That's not what they mean. They're saying people who use certain styles and feature that would use the word Jehovah. Then the Elohist, that is like those who Elohim, and I'm going to talk more about this, the Deuteronomist, and then the priestly. Now, this, of course, is who they say wrote Leviticus. And ultimately, I don't want to get into all that. The key verses, it's really not that significant. But ultimately, what they're saying is that God's personal relationship in anthropomorphic view, I don't know. I'm going to do it this way. This works better for me. They're saying that some of it was written around 950 to 850 BC, and stories about traditions from Judah to the southern kingdom is where that came from. And some of it was written by around 850, 750 BC, and those were stories written from traditions of Israel in the northern kingdom. Well, they would permeate and redact, edit Genesis and Exodus. Then others for Deuteronomy in around 750 to 622, they would, called Deuteronomists, they would write, modify the covenant theology developed during the reforms of the King Joshua in his period. But then for our study here is around 500 to 400 BC, various different priestly sources. We don't have names, just potential types of sources. Priestly materials that were developed during and after the exile. And you can see the logic behind the thinking is that, during and after the exile, they didn't have the temple, they didn't have the tabernacle. And so basically during this period, these priestly sources are modifying and putting some explanations of what we actually see. Well, that's a false view. And let me show you why it's a false view. I want to go to, I think here. Well, that's not it. Oh, I think I wrote it in my notes. I didn't put it. It's wrong for several reasons. Number one, first and most important, Jesus said Moses wrote it. Okay. He said he wrote it in, I'll put this down here so you can get it in Mark 7 and verse 10. Moses said in Mark 12 and verse 26, he calls it the book of Moses. In John 5 in verses 46 through 47, he says, if you believe Moses, you will believe me, for he wrote me of me. And so if the documentary hypothesis theory is true, then Jesus is wrong. Moses didn't write. And so anyone who confesses Jesus as Lord and believes that he is the Son of God and takes this theory, you have to say Jesus is wrong, because Jesus said Moses wrote it. And so to assume some other source at a later period of time wrote it would be to contradict Jesus' word. Secondly, the Bible itself says Moses wrote it. Exodus 24 and verse 4, I'll write it down. 24 and verse 4 says that Moses wrote down all the words of the Lord. Well, how many words is all? And who's that wrote all? Moses. In Deuteronomy 31, verse 9 describes Moses writing the law and handing it to the priests. And Joshua, Kings, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Malachi all refer to the law of Moses as a book written by a real book written by a real person. And so the Old Testament itself affirms that Moses is the writer. Thirdly, and here's where I think Wellhausen's argument really falls against, I say it already falls apart, but it just doesn't work. His argument, if you put everything else aside, his argument just doesn't work. The biggest piece of evidence that that the Bible uses, his biggest piece of evidence is the Bible uses two different names. It uses Elohim and Yahweh. Yahweh. Right. Two different names. And that's true. In Genesis, there's only one name used. I forget which one. I'd have to go back and study it. You probably know. In Exodus, both names are used. However, it's really a bad reasoning to assume that is because two different names are used in Genesis 1 and versus Genesis 2, that they must have different authors. My kids might call me Dad, and somebody else might call me Dave or whatever. Somebody else might call me a coach or something of that nature. I'm still the same person, but I can be referred to in using with different pronouns, different names. The same person, it's the same person, and if the name fits the context, then the Bible, Yahweh is God's personal covenant name. And when using that, it's relative to his relationship with people, Elohim is much more general name for God as a creator. And so I think it's Genesis 1 that uses Elohim, and I think Genesis 2 uses both Yahweh Elohim. And of course, the writers would transliterate Elohim into, or Yahweh into Adonai, Lord God, Lord God, Lord God. Well, that's Yahweh Elohim. That's Yahweh Elohim. And so the names give us something theological, tell us something theological about who is speaking. And it's not just telling us about a different author. So I think his argument really just really is bad reasoning. Archaeology also shows that that's wrong, and I won't get into all the archaeology stuff. It's just detailed. There's other things, but I think that's enough for now. I do want to point out and why this matters. The bottom line is this documentary hypothesis was a 19th century theory built on a philosophy of assumptions about religious evolution. Here's what Wellhausen started with. He started with the thought that the complexity in Leviticus was too much for simple initial priests to have developed. That had to develop over time. You go from simple to complex, not complex to simple, but from simple to complex. And so his view is that had to be something that was evolved over time. And then that people later had that detail and they wrote it back into Leviticus to make it more complete. That's really false logic. Some of the things that he did, that Wellhausen did, is called affirming the consequence or false dichotomy. If the logic says that if A is true, then B, we'd expect to see B, right? So if it's true that the Pentateuch had multiple authors because there's different names, we would expect to see different names. And because we see different names, there must be multiple authors. Well, that's not only circular reasoning, that's what's called affirming the consequent. Hey, I expect to see this, and sure enough, I do see this. You basically build it into your argument. False dichotomy refers to that there are, assumes that there's only two options. It's either this or this. And it doesn't give recognition to the possibility of other options. It just ignores that. And that's what he did. And basically what he's doing is what's called begging the question. You assume what you're trying to prove. Look, I assume that there's multiple authors, and so I'm going to prove that by the fact that there are multiple authors, and it's called begging the question. Anyway, it's good to have an understanding of this false like logical reasoning and fallacies. It's more like eisegesis. Exegesis is to draw out from the text. Eisegesis is to put in.
Eisegesis is writing it in. Okay.
Right. So you start putting that into the text. So I believe that's the case. I think that's synonymous with begging the question. So anyway, that's, again, not my area of expertise. I have understanding, but not exactly recollection per se.
Understood.
Okay, I want to talk about the date real quick. Let me see, where am I at? Let's double check because I want to make sure. I know I got to go into the structure of this in a moment and look at my time. Quick, the date aligns back with some of the same things about who wrote what and when. And so the typical date would be more associated with the earlier date would be 1445 BC in that time frame. And that follows really if you look at 1 Kings chapter 6, there's this calculation. You can calculate 480 years before Solomon's temple. You can back up from Solomon's temple and you get 480 years, which would make it 1445 BC. And so that's a logical way.
With the sophistication around Egypt, can we then say Moses was well educated and trained to be able to write these books?
Can we say he was well educated by Egyptian? Is that what you're saying?
Well trained in Egypt to be able to write these books.
Oh, without a doubt. There's two things, and I don't remember the passages, but it's brought up in Exodus. Of course, we know that Moses was put into the basket into the Nile River, and the princess, whatever her name was, the Pharaoh's daughter, found it and adopted. But who did she hire? She hired the mother of Moses. to be the nanny, the babysitter for Moses. So Moses was trained in Egyptian practices, including theology, but he was also trained by his mother. So he was well suited to write these. So I think your point is he had the skill to write, and he certainly did. So I think that's a good point.